Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 1944. A single radio operator crouches in frozen mud, microphone pressed to lips, and speaks coordinates that will turn an entire artillery battalion against itself. War is mathematics, trajectory angles, shell velocities, grid references that translate landscape into numbers. But mathematics requires truth. And truth, in the chaos of combat, becomes the most weaponized commodity of all. The German offensive that history would call the Battle of the Bulge began before dawn on December 16, 1944. 3 armies, 30 divisions, 250,000 men driving west through snow-choked forests toward the Meuse River. The plan: split Allied forces in two, recapture Antwerp, force a negotiated peace before the crushing weight of American industry could finish what D-Day had started. Wehrmacht artillery led the assault, 1,500 guns, Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, the heaviest concentration of German firepower since Kursk. The barrage shredded American positions along an 85-mile front. Communications went dark. Command posts collapsed. Infantry companies simply vanished in the opening hours, erased by shells they never heard coming. By December 18th, German spearheads had punched 30 miles into Allied lines. Bastogne was surrounded, St. Vith was collapsing, and in a narrow sector near the village of Malmedy, a 23-year-old signal specialist named Technical Sergeant Douglas Warner sat in a bunker that no longer appeared on any friendly map, listening to traffic that shouldn't exist. Warner had been a radio operator for 11 months, trained at Fort Knox, deployed through Normandy, fluent in procedure, frequencies, and the peculiar cadence of military radio discipline. He understood that every transmission carried patterns. Call signs rotated daily. Authentication codes changed hourly. But beneath the encryption, beneath the deliberate chaos of wartime communication security, certain rhythms persisted. Rhythms that could be learned, memorized, exploited. German artillery operated on a predictable architecture. Forward observers radioed coordinates to fire direction centers. Fire direction centers calculated solutions and transmitted orders to gun batteries. Gun batteries acknowledged, fired, and waited for corrections. The cycle repeated until the target ceased to exist. Warner had monitored these exchanges for months, cataloging frequencies, timing the intervals between observation and impact, building a mental map of how German artillery thought. He knew their doctrine better than some of their own operators. On the morning of December 19th, his position was already lost. The unit he'd been attached to, a field artillery battalion of the 106th Infantry Division, had disintegrated during the first 48 hours. Officers dead, radios destroyed, men scattered into forests where every shadow might hide a Panzer or an SS patrol. Warner and 4 others had retreated to a log-reinforced bunker, originally dug by Belgian farmers, now camouflaged under deadfall and snow. No rations remained. Ammunition was down to 17 rounds per rifle, and Warner's radio, a SCR-300 backpack set, was the only functioning communications equipment in a 12-mile radius. He could transmit, he could receive, but he had no one to call. The bunker itself was barely large enough for 5 men. Dirt floor, log ceiling reinforced with scavenged steel plates, 2 firing slits covered with burlap. The temperature hovered just above freezing, warm enough to prevent frostbite, but cold enough that breath formed clouds and fingers went numb after minutes of exposure. They'd been there 36 hours, sleeping in shifts, listening to German patrols pass within yards of their position, waiting for a decision that none of them wanted to make. Surrender meant prisoner camps. Staying meant slow starvation or discovery. Moving meant navigating 12 miles of enemy-held forest with no maps, no support, and no way to distinguish American lines from German ones until someone started shooting. Warner spent those hours listening. The German forward observer was using frequency 4.715 megahertz. Warner identified him by pattern recognition. The observer transmitted in bursts of 6 seconds, paused for 4, transmitted again. The rhythm matched doctrine Warner had memorized from captured manuals. More importantly, the observer was close. Signal strength suggested less than 2 miles, and the coordinates being called in, grid references in the German system, were landing shells on American positions Warner recognized from maps now reduced to ash. The Fire Direction Center responded on 4.680 megahertz. Same pattern, same discipline. Warner could hear the calculations in real time, deflection adjustments, charge selections, range corrections refined to 10-meter increments. The Germans weren't guessing. They were surgically dismantling what remained of the American line, battery by battery, target by target. Each transmission was a death sentence for men Warner would never meet. Soldiers who didn't know they were being observed, calculated, erased by mathematics spoken in clipped German consonants across distances measured in megahertz. Warner spoke fluent German. His grandparents had emigrated from Saxony in 1921. He'd grown up in Milwaukee, hearing Hochdeutsch at dinner tables and church services. His mother had insisted the children maintain the language, not from nostalgia, but from practical immigrant pragmatism. Languages opened doors, created opportunities. She couldn't have imagined that her insistence on proper grammar would one day give her son the ability to understand the men trying to kill him. The Army had flagged his language file during basic training, assigned him to signals intelligence when they learned he could distinguish Bavarian from Prussian accents on scratchy radio intercepts. He didn't just understand the German transmissions, he understood the personalities behind them. The forward observer was young. Mid-20s, probably. His voice carried the crisp confidence of recent officer training. No hesitation, no doubt. He spoke coordinates the way a surgeon calls for instruments. Precise, economical, certain. The Fire Direction Center was older. A veteran. Warner could hear it in the vocal compression, the way the man clipped his syllables, impatient with protocol but never sloppy. They were professionals, competent, efficient, and they were killing Americans with extraordinary precision. Warner realized he could interrupt that conversation. The idea came not as inspiration, but as technical observation. He'd been monitoring German communications since Normandy. 7 months of intercepts, hundreds of hours cataloging call signs, authentication protocols, frequency patterns. The knowledge had been academic, useful for intelligence reports, valuable for understanding enemy capabilities, but ultimately passive. He listened. He translated, he filed reports. He'd never considered intervention. But the circumstances were different now. He wasn't at a secure headquarters with layers of command authority and operational restrictions. He was in a hole in the ground with 4 other soldiers and a radio that connected to nothing friendly within range. Standard doctrine didn't apply because standard circumstances had ceased to exist. He could transmit on German frequencies. He could speak their language, and they had no reason to suspect an American operator would attempt what he was considering. The technical challenge was trivial. German radio security in December 1944 was competent but not sophisticated. Call signs rotated, yes. Authentication protocols existed, yes. But field artillery networks prioritized speed over encryption. A forward observer under fire couldn't waste seconds fumbling with codebooks. The system assumed physical security. That German-controlled territory meant German-controlled airwaves. They hadn't planned for an American operator who spoke German like a native and understood their procedures better than most of their own radio men. The vulnerability was structural, not technical. Warner waited until the next fire mission began. The observer called coordinates, 6-second transmission, grid reference, target description, requested effect, his voice steady, professional, routine. This was his 15th fire mission in 3 days. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged, repeated the coordinates for confirmation, calculated deflection and elevation, and during the 4-second pause before the next transmission, Warner keyed his microphone and spoke. Not in English, in German, using the forward observer's call sign. His voice matched the observer's pitch, same accent, same cadence, and the words were a correction. A 3-digit adjustment to the original grid reference, not dramatic, not obvious, just the kind of minor refinement that happens constantly during fire missions when observers walk rounds onto target. The Fire Direction Center rogered the change, no suspicion, no question. The adjustment was small enough to seem routine. Forward observers corrected coordinates constantly as targets moved or initial calculations proved inaccurate. The Fire Direction Center calculated a new solution and gave the order to fire. Warner had shifted the impact point 400 meters west, away from American positions, into empty forest. The shells landed in snow and frozen earth, killing trees. Warner sat in darkness, headphones pressed to his ears, listening to the aftermath. The forward observer transmitted again within 90 seconds, confused now, asking why his fire mission had missed the target. The Fire Direction Center replied with mild irritation, repeating the coordinates they'd received, the coordinates Warner had inserted. The observer insisted those weren't his numbers. The Fire Direction Center, annoyed, told him to re-authenticate and resubmit. While they argued, Warner studied his map. It was a captured German tactical map taken from a destroyed vehicle 3 weeks earlier. The grid system was different from American maps. Reference points used German place names. But Warner had spent months learning to read these maps, translating between coordinate systems, understanding how German units oriented themselves in terrain. 400 meters had been a test, proof of concept, confirmation that his accent was good enough, his procedure accurate enough, his timing precise enough to insert himself into their communication loop without detection. Now he needed to think geometrically. Artillery positions don't move quickly. The guns firing at American lines were dug in, camouflaged, protected by infantry. Warner didn't know their exact location, but he knew their approximate bearing from the impact pattern of previous missions. Shells had been landing consistently from the northeast. Forward observers typically worked 1 to 3 kilometers ahead of their batteries, close enough to see targets, but distant enough to avoid counter-battery fire. If he could identify where the observer was standing and where the guns were firing from, he could calculate a vector. More importantly, he could calculate coordinates that would place impact on the guns themselves. The geometry was straightforward. The execution was not. Warner needed to estimate distances he couldn't measure, account for terrain he couldn't see, and translate his calculations into the German grid system with accuracy sufficient to hit a target perhaps 300 meters wide and 200 meters deep. Artillery batteries dispersed their guns. Too tight, and a single counter-battery mission could destroy everything. Too loose, and command and control became impossible. Standard doctrine placed guns 40 to 60 meters apart in a rough line perpendicular to the direction of fire. Warner had one chance. If he miscalculated, the shells would land harmlessly. The Germans would recognize deception. They'd change frequencies, update authentication protocols, and his window of opportunity would close permanently. If he calculated correctly, he might destroy the guns that had been killing Americans for 3 days. The next fire mission began within 6 minutes. The observer called fresh coordinates, a new target, probably a suspected American command post or a crossroads where supplies might be moving. His voice carried the same professional detachment, another calculation, another transmission, another set of men about to die by mathematics. Warner let the first transmission complete, let the Fire Direction Center acknowledge. Then, during the brief pause before the guns received their final firing data, Warner keyed his microphone and transmitted a complete override. New coordinates, his accent perfect, his call sign correct, his tone impatient, as though correcting an incompetent Fire Direction Center that had somehow garbled his original message. He added irritation to his voice. Not anger, but the frustrated precision of an officer dealing with subordinates who couldn't get basic procedures right. The numbers he gave were precise. He'd calculated them from his map, measuring distances with a ruler, accounting for the German grid system's peculiarities, cross-referencing against every transmission he'd monitored over the past hour. He'd estimated the battery position based on acoustic analysis, the sound delay between radio transmission and the distant thump of guns firing. Not perfect, but close. The coordinates placed the impact point exactly where Warner believed the German artillery battery was positioned. The Fire Direction Center questioned the change. The numbers were significantly different from what the observer had just transmitted. The shift was large enough to raise suspicion. Warner could hear hesitation in the Fire Direction Center's response, a request for confirmation, a question about whether the observer had reversed digits or made an error. Warner responded with clipped authority. He didn't apologize, didn't explain. He simply insisted the new coordinates were correct, adding a detail about terrain features that matched the sector, a destroyed church, a small stream, reference points that appeared on German tactical maps. It was a gamble, If he'd miscalculated, the deception would collapse. If his German wasn't quite right, if his tone didn't match an officer's expectation, if any detail failed, they'd recognize an imposter. But Warner had spent 11 months listening to these men. He knew how they spoke, how they thought, how they expected to be obeyed. The Fire Direction Center accepted the coordinates. There was a pause. 5 seconds. Warner imagined the calculations happening at the Fire Direction Center. Men plotting numbers on maps, setting mechanical computers, translating grid references into deflection angles and propellant charges. The machinery of artillery converting abstract coordinates into physical violence. The Fire Direction Center transmitted firing data, deflection, elevation, charge. The same clinical precision that had been killing Americans all morning, now aimed at coordinates that Warner had calculated in a frozen bunker with a ruler and a captured map. And the guns fired. 8 150mm howitzers, each shell carrying 15 kilograms of high explosive, traveling at 700 meters per second, arcing through gray December sky toward a target that believed itself safe behind its own lines. Warner would never know precisely what happened when those shells landed. He heard the detonations, muffled thumps carried on cold air, distant but unmistakable, not the sharp crack of small arms or the ripping canvas sound of incoming artillery. These were deep, ground-shaking concussions, multiple impacts within seconds. He counted 6 distinct explosions before the sounds blurred together. Then he heard the radio traffic erupt into chaos, the Fire Direction Center screaming for a ceasefire, voices overlapping, panicked, discipline disintegrating. Someone yelling about casualties, someone else demanding to know what coordinates had been transmitted. The forward observer shouting that he hadn't called those numbers, that someone had interfered, that the entire network was compromised. Other voices joined, other call signs. German radio discipline, normally rigid and controlled, dissolved into confusion and panic. Warner heard officers demanding reports. He heard someone screaming for medics. He heard the Fire Direction Center trying to restore order, trying to understand what had happened, trying to determine whether the incident was enemy action or catastrophic error. Then silence, not complete. The frequencies stayed active, but the coordinated fire mission stopped. No new coordinates, no new targets. The artillery network that had been methodically destroying American positions for 3 days simply ceased operations in that sector. Warner didn't transmit again. He had accomplished something. He didn't know the scale, but the absence of German artillery was confirmation enough. He switched frequencies and spent the next 2 hours trying to reach friendly forces, cycling through American battalion frequencies, calling for any station, any unit that might still be operational. At 13:47 hours, a faint response. A signals operator with the 7th Armored Division 10 miles south. They'd believed everyone in Warner's sector was dead or captured. Communications had been dark for 2 days. The operator was shocked to hear an American transmission from coordinates the Germans supposedly controlled. Warner provided his position, requested instructions, was told to hold and wait for extraction if possible, or attempt to infiltrate south if enemy pressure increased. He was given authentication codes and a schedule for future contact attempts. The 5 men stayed in the bunker for another 31 hours. They heard German patrols. They heard vehicles. They heard nothing that suggested the enemy knew 5 Americans were hiding in a hole 12 feet away from roads the Wehrmacht was using to move supplies forward. On December 21st, American reconnaissance elements probed back into the sector. Warner made contact with a platoon from the 82nd Airborne Division. By then, American reinforcements had stabilized the line across most of the bulge. The German offensive was still dangerous, still pushing in some sectors, but the initial momentum had broken against fuel shortages and unexpectedly fierce resistance. By December 26th, Patton's Third Army had relieved Bastogne. By January, the bulge was collapsing. The full story emerged through interrogation reports filed weeks later. A captured German artillery officer, wounded during the American counteroffensive, mentioned an incident from the 3rd day of the offensive. His battery, 8 guns of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's artillery regiment, had been firing support missions near Malmedy when they received coordinates that placed impact directly on their own position. 4 guns destroyed completely. Barrels twisted, carriages shattered. The The remaining 4 guns damaged but repairable. 19 men killed instantly, 31 wounded, 12 critically. The battery commander, who survived with shrapnel wounds to his legs, initially suspected sabotage, perhaps Belgian resistance, perhaps infiltrators. But post-mission analysis suggested radio interference or operator error. No one considered enemy infiltration of their communications network. That possibility existed outside their operational framework. The battery was out of action for 8 days. By the time replacement guns arrived and crews were reorganized, the offensive had stalled. The battery never regained its position in the line. It was pulled back, refitted, and eventually destroyed during the Rhine crossing in March 1945. Warner's after-action report, filed in February 1945, was classified immediately. Not for secrecy, the tactical details were unremarkable by then, but for doctrine. The implications required study. If one American operator with language skills and a captured frequency list could neutralize an artillery battery through deception, what prevented the enemy from attempting similar operations? What if German operators with English skills were already attempting the same techniques against American communications? The report circulated through signals intelligence channels, prompted revisions to authentication protocols, influenced post-war communication security architecture, generated recommendations for voice pattern analysis and multilingual operator screening. But Warner never received recognition beyond a Bronze Star with a citation so vague it might have described anything from repairing a Jeep to storming a pillbox. His name appeared in no histories of the Bulge. No memoirs mentioned him. The incident was too small, too technical, too classified to fit the narrative of Bastonia's heroism or the Meuse River's strategic importance. The medal came in a brief ceremony at division headquarters. No explanation, no detail, just a ribbon pinned to his uniform and a handshake from a colonel who'd never heard the full story and never would. Warner didn't object. He understood classification, understood operational security, and understood that what he'd done wasn't heroism in the conventional sense. He hadn't charged a machine gun nest or held a bridge against impossible odds. He'd sat in a bunker and spoken 80 seconds of German in the correct accent with the correct procedure at the correct moment. The results were lethal, but the act itself was technical. He returned to Milwaukee in November 1945, worked as an electrical engineer for Milwaukee Electric Tool Company, designed motor controllers, taught himself television repair when the technology emerged in the late 40s, married in 1948, raised 3 children, built a comfortable suburban life that looked nothing like the frozen bunker where he'd made the most important decisions of his war. He spoke about the war rarely. When pressed by his children, he'd mention Normandy beaches, Belgian villages, the usual veteran topics that mixed nostalgia with careful omission. He never mentioned the radio, never mentioned the German voices, never mentioned the moment when he'd made the decision to speak and the 80 seconds that followed. His wife knew something had happened. Spouses always know, but she didn't press. The generation that fought World War II carried their stories differently than later generations would. They returned home and moved forward, built suburbs, raised families, created the economic expansion that defined the 50s and 60s. They didn't talk. Warner died in 1997, age 76, having spoken about that December morning almost never. His obituary in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel mentioned military service, the Bronze Star, and a long career in electrical engineering. 120 words summarizing 76 years. The classified report was declassified in 1993. By then, the Cold War had ended. The techniques Warner had improvised were obsolete, replaced by digital encryption and satellite communications. The report was filed in the National Archives, where it joined millions of other documents from a war that had ended half a century earlier. No journalist found it. No historian wrote about it. It remained an artifact known only to specialists studying the evolution of military communication security. The technical achievement deserves examination beyond mythology. Warner didn't trick an entire army. He interrupted one fire direction center for perhaps 90 minutes. 4 guns destroyed from a Wehrmacht arsenal that still fielded thousands. 19 casualties in a battle that consumed over 80,000 American and nearly 100,000 German lives. The mathematical impact was negligible. Individual artillery batteries were destroyed constantly throughout the war. Counter-battery fire, airstrikes, logistics failures. The loss of one battery didn't alter strategic calculations or operational plans. German artillery continued firing across the Bulge. American positions continued taking casualties. But mathematics isn't the only calculus of war. Artillery operates on trust. Forward observers trust their radios connect to their guns. Fire direction centers trust coordinates come from observers who see the battlefield. Gun crews trust the numbers will place steel on enemy positions, not friendly ones. Break that trust, even once, even in a single sector, and the entire system hesitates. Hesitation creates gaps. Gaps allow survival. And survival, for the soldiers who held that stretch of the Ardennes through December 1944, was the margin between annihilation and reinforcement. Warner exploited a structural vulnerability that had nothing to do with technology. The Germans possessed excellent radios. Their encryption was adequate for field use. Their operators were trained and disciplined. But their system assumed territorial control meant communicational control. They couldn't imagine an enemy operator inside their decision loop, speaking their language, understanding their doctrine well enough to impersonate them convincingly enough to kill them. That assumption was their weakness, not technical, philosophical. Modern military communications infrastructure is built against what Warner demonstrated. Authentication now requires cryptographic tokens that rotate continuously. Voice recognition algorithms flag anomalous transmissions. Artificial intelligence monitors network traffic for pattern deviations. Communication security assumes compromise and builds redundancy accordingly. The systems are harder, denser, less vulnerable to single points of improvisation. But they're also more complex, more dependent on infrastructure that must survive first contact with an enemy whose plans we haven't predicted and whose capabilities we may have underestimated. Warner succeeded because he was alone, improvising with equipment that fit in a backpack, making decisions no commander authorized and no doctrine anticipated. He had no oversight, no coordination, no approval chain, just linguistic skill, technical understanding, and the clarity of mind to recognize an opportunity while crouching in a bunker that might be overrun within hours. The lesson isn't that deception wins wars. Wars are won by logistics, production, strategy, and the accumulated weight of industrial economies translating resources into violence. Warner's intervention changed nothing about those fundamentals. Germany was losing in December 1944 whether or not one artillery battery destroyed itself. The mathematical inevitability of Allied victory was determined by production figures in Detroit and oil fields in Texas and shipyards on both coasts. Individual actions don't alter those calculations. But the lesson is that within the vast machinery of modern war, individual decisions still create localized outcomes that ripple beyond their immediate moment. A radio operator's 80-second transmission prevented a fire mission. That prevented casualties. Those soldiers survived to hold a position. That position anchored a line. That line delayed a breakthrough. The delay allowed reinforcement, none of which appears in strategic histories because it happened at a scale too small for generals to see and too technical for narratives built on valor and sacrifice. The division commanders planning operations never knew. The Corps staff analyzing enemy capabilities never knew. The historians writing official accounts never knew. The story existed only in a classified report and in Warner's memory. But the men who walked out of those frozen forests in January knew something had changed. They'd heard the German shells stop falling. They'd wondered why. They'd taken advantage of the silence to consolidate positions, evacuate wounded, bring up ammunition. Small tactical advantages that accumulated into survival. And survival accumulated into the ability to hold long enough for Patton to arrive, for the weather to clear, for Allied air power to obliterate German supply columns. In a war that killed by mathematics, sometimes survival came down to someone understanding the numbers better than the enemy expected. The Ardennes Forest is quiet now. The bunkers have collapsed. The coordinates Warner transmitted are meaningless without the context of armies that no longer exist. Belgian farmers work fields where men once died. German and American tourists visit memorials together. The mathematical precision of artillery has been replaced by the mathematical precision of guided missiles and satellite targeting. But the principle endures in every conflict where information moves faster than bullets and truth becomes the first tactical objective. One man with a radio and a lie. 400 meters of precision, 80 seconds of perfect German. And 19 enemy soldiers killed by their own artillery because someone understood that in war, trust is a weapon that cuts both ways.